So far, the examples I've shown of using the data sources window have been for generating the UI as well as the bindings on the UI properties of that control. Data sources window is also capable of just hooking up the binding on an existing control. So for example, if I go to the toolbox and go grab a text box and put it out here on the UI, I could then decide what I want to put in that text box. In this case, I'm going to add another data source. So I'm going to grab the object data source. I'm going to go to my ZA data and we'll pick product this time and click finish. You can see the icon here that it's mapped to the data grid by default, and you can see our customizations from a previous demo there that combo box also shows up now. What I could do is expand and say that maybe it's the name of the property that I want to put into this text box. So I can drag and drop that onto the existing text box, and you can see that the icon changes to a shortcut arrow. If I release, basically, it made no modifications to the control in terms of its layout or position. All it did is added a binding for the default property for that control type, so the text property for a text box, and it bound it to the property on the data bound object we dragged onto it, so name in this case. It also added a couple other things. As I talked about in a previous demo, it's always going to put mode two-way on there for an input control. It puts these validation properties on here that we'll get to in a later module. And then in this case, because we drag and dropped a new entity type that didn't already have a data source, you can see it hooked it up using a source. You can see it hooked it up using a source binding pointing to some resource. If we go back up to the top of our UI now, we can see it added a new collection view source with a design instance type of data product. So similar to what I had covered before for creating this customer source that it reused for all the different drag and drops of customers, it's going to create one collection view source for a given entity type, and then all the subsequent drag and drops will use that single collection view source if they're using that same entity type. You can certainly break that up on your own and change things around, use MVVM to point to properties on a view model, or create different instances of collection view sources, possibly for the same entity type, that you populate with different sets of collections. But the designer is just trying to map it to a type, so it sets up a single collection view source per type. We could also do something similar for a collection-oriented control. I could drag and drop a list box out here. We won't worry too much about the presentation there. If I then go back to my data sources window and drag and drop an entity type onto that list box and go look at the XAML and what it did there, we can see the list box was pre-existing in this case, so all it hooked up for us were the data binding properties again. So it sets up the item source, again pointing to that product view source that was already up in the resources section, and it sets the display member path and selected value path to the first string property that it finds on that entity type, which in this case was description. Again, you're generally going to have to tweak those to what you intend them to be. Probably name for the display member path on a product, and ID for the product ID. So that's how you can use drag and drop operations to hook up data bindings to existing controls. In the end, as you can see, it's not really writing that much code for you. As an experienced XAML developer, I find it easier to just drop into the XAML and write the bindings myself, especially because in Visual Studio 2012, they added IntelliSense for bindings. You can see here I get IntelliSense down to the properties of a binding, where I can set the path equal to name, and I can set source equal to a static resource for product view source. But the one thing it did do, which was nice, was the declaration of that collection view source for me up in the resources section and getting this all hooked up. So that can definitely save you a little bit of time getting things wired up.